within every single one of us. Inside the 3 billion letters of code that make up human DNA lies more than just the blueprint for our bodies. Hidden in that code are stories. Some are uplifting, like the tale of how our species survived near extinction almost 1,000,000 years ago. Others are strange curiosities, like the genes that shaped our taste for bitterness, or the one that makes some people resistant to malaria. But buried deep in our chromosomes is one story that is far darker than the rest. A story so violent, so bloody, and so immense in scale that it may represent the first truly global conflict humanity ever experienced. If this conflict happened today, the death toll would be almost beyond imagination. Nearly 4 billion men across the world would vanish, leaving behind only about 200 million survivors. Women, by contrast, would outnumber men by as much as 17 to 1. This isn't a dystopian novel. This isn't a Netflix script. This is real. And the shocking part is that the proof doesn't come from ancient scrolls or the ruins of a battlefield. It comes from our own DNA. That's right, the genetic code of modern humans carries the fingerprint of what scientists now believe was a cataclysmic collapse in the male population. One so devastating that it reshaped the genetic landscape of the entire Old World, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. So what happened? Why did men nearly vanish? And how could such a disaster remain hidden from history until modern genetics revealed it? To answer those questions, we need to follow the trail of science, because DNA doesn't lie. To understand what researchers uncovered, let's start with something called a genetic bottleneck. Imagine you have a massive library with millions of books. One day, a fire breaks out, and only a few hundred books survive. From then on, every copy, every new edition, every story is based only on those surviving books. The variety, the richness, the unique voices that once filled the library, gone forever. That's exactly what happens in a genetic bottleneck. A species or population suffers a massive drop in numbers. When only a handful survive, the genetic diversity shrinks, sometimes permanently. Humans have been through bottlenecks before. About 900,000 years ago, during an ice age, our entire species nearly went extinct. Studies suggest the global human population may have dwindled to as few as a few thousand breeding individuals. Somehow, our ancestors scraped through, and humanity carried on. But the bottleneck I'm talking about wasn't caused by glaciers or volcanic eruptions. It wasn't nature this time, it was us. When researchers examined modern human genomes, they noticed something odd. Around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, during the late Neolithic period, there was evidence of a massive decline in genetic diversity. But here's the twist. The decline wasn't across the board. It was specific to the Y chromosome. The genetic material passed directly from father to son. Meanwhile, the mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through mothers, showed no such collapse. Women's genetic diversity remained intact. That means something wiped out men on a staggering scale, while women, for the most part, survived. And wiped out might not even capture the scale of what happened. Scientists estimate that during this bottleneck, the effective male population in the Old World shrank by up to 95%. Imagine walking into a community of 20 men. 19 of them would be gone. Only one would remain to carry on his family line. Nothing in recorded history even comes close. Not World War I, not World War II, not the Black Death, not even the Mongol conquests. By percentage, this was the deadliest event men have ever faced. Naturally, scientists wondered if this wasn't a natural disaster. What was it? The first clue lies in the very fact that the bottleneck was so one-sided. If a volcanic eruption, a famine, or an epidemic had swept across Neolithic Europe and Asia, we would expect both men and women to die in roughly equal numbers. But this wasn't equal. This was selective. Something targeted men specifically. And when researchers paired the genetic evidence with the archaeological record, a chilling picture began to emerge. Across Europe and beyond, mass graves dating to this exact period began to tell the same story: violence, massacres, war. Our DNA was pointing us toward a truth that bones buried in the ground had been whispering for centuries. DNA gave us the first clue. But if billions of men were lost in a wave of violence, we would expect to find bodies, lots of them. And we have. Across Europe, archaeologists have uncovered over 250 sites from the late Neolithic period that show unmistakable signs of mass violence. Not one or two isolated murders. Not the occasional tribal skirmish. But systematic, large-scale massacres. Let's start in Germany. Around 5000 BC, with a site that has become infamous, the Talheim Death Pit. Here, scientists unearthed the remains of at least 34 people. Men, women, and children, all brutally slain. What's striking is that none of the skeletons showed defensive wounds, no broken arms from blocking blows. No signs of fighting back. These weren't warriors who died in battle. They were civilians, fleeing for their lives. The killing blows fell into three categories: sharp cuts from stone axes, blunt force trauma from clubs, and a few arrows. But the head was almost always the target. Nearly every skull showed lethal cranial injuries. In many cases, multiple blows were delivered, as if the killers wanted to leave no chance of survival. 16 of the victims were children. 9 were adult men. 7 were older women. And what's missing? Young women of childbearing age. They weren't in the pit. The chilling implication is that they were taken by the attackers' captives, trophies, perhaps future wives. Talheim wasn't an isolated event. Just across the border in Austria, another site tells an even bloodier story, Schletzesbarn, also dating to around 5000 BC. Here, archaeologists found the remains of at least 200 people dumped into a mass grave. Once again, women of reproductive age were largely absent, suggesting abduction. But this massacre had a particularly gruesome twist. Many of the victims had been dismembered, limbs severed, skulls separated from bodies. In some cases, bones were scattered as though ritualistically broken. This wasn't simple raiding. This was annihilation, an attempt to erase an entire community. And then there's Herxheim, also in Germany, which may be the darkest site of them all, dating from roughly 5300 to 4950 BC. Herxheim wasn't just a mass grave. It was a factory of death. Excavations revealed at least 80 pits surrounding a settlement, each filled with human remains. The total number of victims is estimated at over 1,000 people, possibly as many as 1,500. To put that into perspective, given the much smaller populations at the time, that would be the equivalent of a modern city building a mass grave with hundreds of thousands of corpses. But it wasn't just the number of dead that horrified researchers. It was what had been done to them. The bodies at Herxheim were systematically processed. Skulls split neatly down the middle. Bones deliberately broken to extract marrow. Jaws, tongues, and even brains carefully removed. Evidence shows that the victims were not only slaughtered, they were cannibalized. Many bones bore signs of cooking. Some were roasted on spits. Others were carved into tools, cups, or ornaments. Skulls were mounted on stakes at the settlement's entrance, perhaps as warnings or as trophies. Researchers believe the people of Herxheim may have been part of a skull cult, using the heads of their enemies in ritual ceremonies. What makes this even more terrifying is the diversity of the victims. Isotope analysis shows they came from different regions, lifestyles, and cultures. Some were farmers. Some were hunter-gatherers. Some came from the mountains. Others from the lowlands. The Herxheim community had the capability to raid far and wide, capturing people from as far as 300 miles away. Imagine it, a settlement of perhaps only 50 residents orchestrating raids and massacres that brought in victims from hundreds of kilometers away, then butchering them in rituals of death. This was organized violence. It required planning, logistics, and tactics. It wasn't mindless chouse, it was calculated cruelty. And it wasn't unique. Across the Neolithic world, similar patterns emerge. Sites where heads were collected. Sites where shins were deliberately broken. Places where strangers were hunted down, mutilated, or even buried alive. In short, the late Neolithic period was soaked in blood. And when you connect the dots from DNA bottlenecks to mass graves, you start to see a horrifying pattern. the first large-scale, cross-regional wave of human warfare. This was no longer the occasional conflict between roaming bands of hunter-gatherers. These were full-scale raids between fortified farming settlements, fueled by the resources of the agricultural revolution. The age of farming had given birth to the age of war. The bones in the ground tell us something chilling. These people were not just unlucky victims. They lived in a world where violence wasn't an exception, it was the rule. To understand just how dangerous Neolithic life was, we need to look at the weapons, the warriors, and the sheer fragility of survival in that time. Weapons of a Stone Age battlefield. When we think of ancient weapons, we often imagine crude tool-stone clubs, maybe a few arrows. But Neolithic fighters had already developed a surprisingly wide arsenal. There were stone axes and adzes, sharpened with such precision that they could crush bone in a single strike. Spears and javelins made from flint or obsidian-tipped wood, capable of piercing flesh from a distance. Bows and arrows, a revolutionary invention that turned any settlement into a target, even behind palisade walls. But it didn't stop there. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of clubs, knives, sickles, scrapers, hammers, and even crude swords. Tools that could harvest crops during the day could become weapons of war by night. The terrifying part? While weapons advanced, defenses did not. Armor, if it existed at all, was primitive, perhaps a hide cloak, woven cloth, or layers of plant material. No helmets, no shields, no metal breastplates. Against a sharp flint axe, human skulls were as fragile as pottery. In other words, these people had figured out how to make better and better ways to kill, but they hadn't yet invented good ways to protect themselves. Warriors without uniforms. Unlike the armies we picture from later history, Neolithic warriors weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, herders, or hunters who picked up weapons when duty or desperation called. Yet the evidence suggests they fought often, perhaps constantly. Analysis of skeletal remains from early farming communities shows that 10 to 23% of individuals bore clear signs of violent injury. And that's just what survived in the bones. Think about that. In a village of 100 people, 10 to 20 would have visible battle scars. And remember, not every weapon left a mark on bone. A slash across the gut, a punctured lung, or an infection from a cut could kill without leaving a trace. Worse still, the injuries show up repeatedly. Many skeletons display healed wounds, meaning survivors lived through one attack only to endure another later in life. For some, violence wasn't a single tragic encounter, it was a recurring fact of existence. Life expectancy in a world of violence. Growing up in this world was an accomplishment in itself. By the late Neolithic, the average lifespan hovered between 20 and 33 years. That number includes infant mortality, of course, but even if you survived childhood, the odds weren't in your favor. Imagine being a 15-year-old boy in a farming settlement. If you were lucky, you might live another 15 years. 30, maybe 33 if you were exceptional. But every day, every hunting trip, every skirmish was a gamble with death. Compare that to today, when life expectancy in much of the world is over 70 years. We think of a 30-year-old as just starting out, barely scratching the surface of adulthood. For Neolithic men, 30 was the twilight of life, and that grim reality was tied directly to violence. Living in constant fear of raids, defending crops, or dying in ambushes meant that surviving long enough to see gray hair was rare. A culture built around violence. Perhaps the most telling detail is that many Neolithic settlements were built like fortresses. Wooden palisades, ditches, and defensive earthworks weren't luxuries, they were necessities. Every village expected to be attacked. That fact alone paints a picture of daily life. Wake up, tend the crops, care for livestock, watch the horizon for smoke or the glint of weapons. Survival was measured not just by harvests, but by whether your settlement could fend off the next raid. And raids weren't just about killing. They were about taking livestock, taking food, taking land, and most chillingly, taking women. Over and over again, mass graves show the absence of young women, suggesting they were abducted, forcibly absorbed into the victors' clans. It's no wonder then that the male genetic lineages collapsed. Men died in staggering numbers. Women survived, but often as captives, carrying the genetic legacy of whichever group emerged victorious. The psychological toll. Try to imagine the mindset of a Neolithic man. You know that 19 out of 20 men like you will not live to pass on their genes. Every neighbor is a potential enemy. Every stranger is a threat. Every meal you eat could be your last. And yet, in a twisted way, this cycle of brutality wasn't random chaos. It had structure. It had purpose. The raids, the massacres, the abductions, they were all part of a larger system of survival in a world where resources were scarce and trust was rarer still. To live in the late Neolithic was to live in a paradox, a world of growing villages, fertile fields, and new technologies, shadowed by constant bloodshed and the looming certainty of death. By now the question seems unavoidable. Why? Why did humans, our own ancestors, turn the world into such a slaughterhouse? Why did entire generations of men vanish from the genetic record while women survived? The truth is, there's no single neat answer. But science, archaeology, and anthropology give us a few powerful theories. And together, they paint a picture of humanity flying too close to the sun. The agricultural revolution, prosperity with a price. For most of human history, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers, small bands moving across the land, following game and foraging for plants. Life wasn't easy, but it had one key advantage: mobility. If a neighboring group became hostile, you could often move on, melt into the landscape, and survive elsewhere. But around 10,000 years ago, something revolutionary happened. People learned to farm. Wheat in the Middle East, rice in China, maize in the Americas. The Neolithic Revolution, as historians call it, transformed the human experience. For the first time, people could settle down permanently. They built villages, then towns. Populations grew. Food surpluses allowed for new crafts, new tools, even early forms of trade. It all sounds like progress, and in many ways, it was. But this success came at a cost. Farming made people vulnerable in ways they had never been before. A band of hunter-gatherers might carry only what they could hold, but a farming settlement had stockpiles of grain, herds of animals, and women concentrated in one place. To outsiders, these settlements looked like gold mines, targets worth raiding. And unlike hunter-gatherers, farmers couldn't just pack up and leave. Their lives were tied to the soil. To defend what they had, they built walls and palisades. But these defenses only reinforced a new reality. Neighbors weren't just competitors anymore, they were threats. The rise of patrilineal clans. One of the most intriguing theories about the Y chromosome bottleneck is tied not just to violence, but to the way Neolithic society was organized. Researchers believe that during this time, many communities began to structure themselves into patrilineal clans groups, organized by male descent. In these clans, trust was built around kinship. If you shared blood with the men around you, you were safe. If you didn't, you were an outsider. This had a profound genetic consequence. Women could often move between groups, marrying into new clans, carrying mitochondrial DNA across communities. But men were much more restricted. Outsiders weren't allowed in. Male lineages became tightly bound to their clans. That meant when one clan waged war on another and won, the losing men weren't just killed. Their entire genetic legacy was erased. Their Y chromosomes died with them. The victors then absorbed the women, spreading their own lineages even further. Over centuries, this cycle of clan warfare and female transfer may have systematically collapsed male diversity, leaving only a few dominant lineages standing. In other words, the genetic bottleneck wasn't just the result of men dying. It was the result of male bloodlines being extinguished wholesale. The violent hypothesis. Of course, not everyone agrees on how extreme the violence was, but the archaeological evidence, mass graves, decapitations, dismemberments, makes a strong case that war and slaughter were central forces. From this perspective, the Neolithic bottleneck looks like the first global war, fought not with tanks and machine guns, but with stone axes and bows. Settlements fortified themselves, raided one another, and waged long campaigns for food, land, and women. Imagine an entire continent locked in cycles of revenge killings. A massacre in one village sparks retaliation from another. Over time, the male population collapses not gradually, but violently, generation after generation. This is the grim vision suggested by the bones. The peaceful hypothesis. But there is another possibility, one less dramatic, but no less fascinating. Some researchers argue that the Y chromosome bottleneck may not have been entirely about bloodshed. Instead, it could have been the result of lineal fission, peaceful process in which clans split apart, each composed of closely related males. Because these new clans were genetically similar, their Y chromosomes weren't very diverse to begin with. Over time, as some lineages failed due to environmental hardship, disease, or lower reproductive success, they simply vanished from the record. Meanwhile, other lineages thrived and expanded, reinforcing their dominance. The result would look very similar to what we see in the DNA today, a collapse of male diversity, even without massacres on the scale of Herxheim. Or both. The most likely answer may be that both forces were at work. Violence was real too, many mass graves prove that. But peaceful social dynamics, clan organization, and reproductive inequality may have amplified the effect. Together, these factors created a perfect storm. Men died in huge numbers from raids and massacres, while clan structures ensured that only a handful of male lineages survived to father future generations. It's a chilling reminder that evolution isn't just shaped by natural forces like climate or disease. Sometimes, it's shaped by user choices. Our conflicts, our wars, the human lesson. So why did humanity turn on itself? In many ways, the answer is simple: survival. Farming gave us new tools, but it also gave us new reasons to kill. It taught us that food could be stolen, land could be seized, women could be taken. It taught us that neighbors could be threats, and that sometimes the surest way to protect your clan was to destroy another. The genetic bottleneck is proof that when survival is at stake, humans are capable of pushing violence to unimaginable extremes. When we look back at the Neolithic bottleneck, it's tempting to think of it as just another chapter in humanity's long and brutal history. But the truth is, this chapter didn't end when the last stone axe was swung or the last village was burned. It lives on in us, the scar that never healed. Even today, geneticists can trace the fingerprints of that ancient slaughter. The Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed from father to son, remains far less diverse than mitochondrial DNA, which is passed through mothers. Think of it like a tree. The branches representing women's lineages spread in countless directions, weaving together across cultures and continents. Meanwhile, the branches for men's lineages look sparse, many cut short, with only a few major trunks carrying most of the weight. That imbalance is the scar of the bottleneck. A reminder that once, thousands of years ago, the world was nearly emptied of its men. What if it never happened? It's an almost unanswerable question, but a fascinating one. What if the bottleneck had never occurred? Without that collapse, male genetic diversity today would likely be far greater. Entire lineages, entire family trees, would still exist. Our world would be populated by men carrying surnames and ancestries that vanished long ago in fields of blood. History itself might have unfolded differently, with more clans surviving. Different cultures might have taken root. Different power structures might have emerged. The map of civilization as we know it could look unrecognizable. It's a reminder that genetics isn't just science's fate. And sometimes, the fate of billions is decided by battles we no longer even remember. Comparing then and now, the strangest part of all this is how far we've come. We live in what historians call the most peaceful era in human history. That might sound ridiculous, given the headlines that bombard us: daily wars, mass shootings, terrorism. But when you look at the numbers, the truth is clear. Per capita, violence is lower than at almost any point in the past. Deaths from war, raids, or massacres are a fraction of what they were in Neolithic times. Back then, simply being born male was almost a death sentence. Life expectancy for men was 20 to 33 years. Today, in much of the world, it's over 70. We forget how extraordinary that is. We forget that not so long ago, the average 30-year-old was an elder, if he even made it that far. The weight of ancestry. And yet, even in our safety, we carry the weight of those who came before. The paranoia of neighbors. The fear of outsiders. The instinct to fight over resources. These are echoes of the world that forged our DNA. Perhaps that's why stories of war, betrayal, and survival still grip us so deeply. They're not just stories. They're memories buried in our genes. They're the whispers of ancestors who lived and died in an age when violence was constant, when survival was fleeting, and when nearly every man was marked for death. The silver lining. If there is a silver lining, it's this: humanity survived. We didn't stay locked in that endless cycle of massacre forever. Over time, as societies grew more complex, as trade and diplomacy developed, as religion and law gave us new ways to resolve conflict, the bloodshed eased. It didn't vanish, not by a long shot, but it slowed enough for civilizations to rise, for lifespans to lengthen, for stories like this one to be remembered not as daily life, but as distant history. Today, when we argue over politics, when we debate policy, when we complain about the stresses of modern life, it's worth pausing to remember our ancestors would have traded everything for the problems we face now. We don't live in fear of skull cults. We don't build walls around our neighborhoods to keep out raiders. Our sons don't face a 95% chance of dying before passing on their name. That is progress. That is the legacy of survival. So what do we make of all this? What do we do with the knowledge that hidden in our DNA is the memory of an ancient war that nearly erased men from the earth? For me, it comes down to two truths. The first is sobering. Violence is not foreign to humanity. It's baked into our history. And for thousands of years, it shaped our very genes. When survival was on the line, our ancestors chose to fight, and the cost was staggering. The second, though, is hopeful. We are not prisoners of that past. The very fact that we can uncover this story, study it, and reflect on it shows how far we've come. We don't live in that world anymore. We don't have to. Lessons from a dark past. The Neolithic bottleneck teaches us that human progress is a double-edged sword. Agriculture gave us food security, but it also gave us reasons to kill each other. Clan loyalty gave us trust, but it also fueled xenophobia. Innovation gave us new weapons, but not the wisdom to wield them responsibly. That same pattern repeats throughout history. Every leap forward carries risk. The question is whether we let the risks consume us or whether we learn to rise above them. The most peaceful time in history. It's worth repeating, by almost every metric. Today is the safest, most peaceful era humanity has ever known. That doesn't mean it's perfect. Wars still rage. Violence still scars communities. But compared to the days when 19 out of 20 men died before passing on their genes, we are living in an age of miracles. Our average lifespan has tripled. Our conflicts, while brutal, are far less likely to wipe entire populations off the map. And for the first time in history, cooperation between nations, not constant warfare, defines much of the global order. A choice for the future. Still, the past whispers to us. It reminds us of what we are capable of, the darkness and the light. In our DNA are the scars of ancient massacres, but also the resilience of survival. In our history are tales of bloodshed, but also stories of rebuilding, forgiveness, and peace. The choice before us is simple. Do we repeat the cycles of our ancestors, or do we finally break them? A final thought. When I think of the Neolithic world, I picture a young boy standing on the palisade of his village, watching the horizon for raiders, knowing his odds of survival are slim. That boy never lived to see old age. His lineage may have ended in the dirt of some forgotten battlefield. And yet, somehow, enough boys survived, enough families endured, enough lineages carried forward that here we are, thousands of years later, with the luxury of asking questions instead of swinging axes. We are the descendants of survivors. Survivors of famine, of disease, of massacre. survivors of the first global war humanity ever waged. And if there is one lesson to take from their sacrifice, it is this: survival is not enough. We owe it to them to do more than endure. We owe it to them to build a world where our children don't carry new scars in their DNA. Because the cycle of violence may be written in our past, but it doesn't have to define our future. So now the question is yours. If our DNA still carries the scars of the first global war, what do you think it means for us today? Are we truly free from the cycle of violence? Or are we just living in the calm before another storm? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. Do you believe humanity has finally broken the pattern? Or do you think history is bound to repeat itself? And if you enjoyed this dive into the hidden stories buried in our DNA, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next journey into humanity's forgotten past. Because trust me, here are still countless secrets written in our bones, our ruins, and yes, even in our genes. Until next time, stay curious and stay human.